Outside the Box Reviews, we are taking a look at the most breakable figures in the world. These are McFarlane Alien vs. Predator Wave 1 Predator figures. On the left, we have the Celtic Predator, and on the right, we have the Elder Predator. Figures like this fall very specifically into that outside the box reviews category, kind of part of the reason I named the channel how I did, because I got both these guys secondhand, loose, missing accessories, and broken. So this isn't going to be the most comprehensive review of these two just because I don't have them in pristine condition. But I also think if I had got them in pristine condition, they wouldn't have survived the review in that state because the plastic on these guys is very, very fragile. I believe all the joints are made up of that clear plastic that if you've ever dealt with it on some of the early Funko articulated figures or DC Direct or any of those companies that have used it in abundance for some strange reason, you know that the joints just crumble apart if you move them incorrectly. And it's part of the reason why I have not yet done a Celtic Predator figure wars, because my example here is really not in good shape to put up against a pristine NECA example. But anyway, I'm going to do the best job I can reviewing these guys, so let's jump right into it. Celtic Predator came with significantly more accessories. He had a display base, which I never had. He also came with a shuriken, and I think this is it. It might be the Wolf Shuriken from NECA, but I'm pretty sure this is the right one. And both figures come with the ceremonial dagger. A little different than NECA's, it's mostly gray. There is a little bit of that copper color brought in here. There's also not an open seam here in the center of the blade. It's all one piece. But overall, the sculpt is fairly nice. And I think if you compare it here to the NECA blade, for having a nearly decade difference in between the two, it's not too shabby. For the head sculpt on Celtic, thanks to the brittleness of this plastic, we're going to have to get a very low angle to be able to see his face. It definitely does have the major Celtic trademarks. We do have that weird biomechanical looking piece there in the front, which is decently sculpted, especially for its age. The coloration is okay. It's kind of a matte silver. There's a little bit of that dimpling texture on it that the NECA figure had, but nowhere near as advanced. The eyes are also just kind of a solid black instead of having that look of mesh. But overall, once again, 10-plus-year-old figure. It's looking really good for what it is. His dreadlocks are a little on the shorter side compared to what NECA did, and they are more pre-posed. They're kind of a harder material, and they don't necessarily really give you a whole lot of range of motion when you're trying to pose the head. Not that I can on this figure anymore. Coming around to the back, we do have his med kit, which I think has some decent detail on it. It's pretty well sculpted. I like the dry brushing on it to make it look scratched up. And you may notice mine is missing the arm. That's because the arm has long since broken off this figure, but we did have a hinge here at the base of the plasma caster. And then here's the rest of it. We have, well, that's where it broke off, the hinge up here, so it would have sat kind of like that. And this arm is ridiculously long with very floppy joints in it, so I don't know how it was ever supposed to stay up, but we do have a hinge here in the midsection, then another hinge at the base of the gun. You can unpeg the gun here if you want to recreate the scene from the film, and then just a very, very large plasma caster, very similarly colored to the rest of the Predator. There's also this kind of section up here at the front that I had to glue back on because it came off when it was shipped to me, and I'm not entirely sure if I glued it on right, but it looks decent. Overall, not a bad plasma caster. It's just ridiculously oversized, and the arm's way too flimsy to give you any real practical posing ability with it. The rest of the bodies on these Predators are pretty much the same, so I'm going to flip between the two examples I have here. So I'll talk briefly about the two last pieces here on Celtic that are very unique. First up is his little bone necklace here, a couple little trophy skulls, very oversized once again. Now McFarlane claimed this was removable from the figure, but I couldn't find a way to actually remove it without damaging the neck, so not really sure how true that claim ended up being by the end of the day. And the other unique feature is here on his left arm. We have the net gun that's unique to Celtic instead of the computer that we see on some of the other Predators, so this is just a static piece and has no real articulation or anything to it, but it is decently sculpted. Switching over to the Elder is unmasked, and I kind of wish he wasn't. Granted, he only shows up like this in the movie, but that is a horrible, horrible face sculpt there. It may not look super bad from the front. We've got his mandibles closed, kind of giving him this puckered look. His eyes are very tiny and close together. We have the scar at the top of his head, and some nice detailing around the crest of his head, and some very bright neon blue dreadlocks that are actually very long on this figure. But what really kills me is when you take this head sculpt and look at it from anything other than straight on, you can see just how awkward and flat it looks. I actually really like that there's detailing here above his eyes, some of the little spikes in there. I hadn't noticed that previously. The scarification, the tattoos on his face, is kind of hinted at, but not super clean. But I just can't get past those mandibles. They are so goofy looking. If we zoom out, we can see how long his dreadlocks are, but they are kind of a pain in the butt because they do fall out of his head very easily. Once again, they're very hard plastic and not malleable and not posable or anything like that. But they look decent coming out of his head there. They're just not very well executed. Around his neck, we have a few unique pieces. One is the collar, which might be on Celtic, but because of the way I had to glue his head back on, I can't really see it beyond all the other crap around his neck. So if it's there, I'd have to break the figure to find it. Then under there, you can see a brown rope with some gold clasps and some red, and that is the clasp for his cape. The cape flows down the back of the figure. It is a rubberized plastic, but not particularly bendable. But I love the detail they put in here. It has a very nice black wash over top of it to darken it up. The wrinkles are nice and deep. I actually think it's a very well executed cape, especially for a figure from this time period. Elder has his own little unique bandolier going across his chest with some different skulls, one of them looking very human. And then as I said before, the bodies on here are very similar. The paint's fairly similar as well. There's not much variance, and I can't even tell if it's an intentional variance. But we do have sculpted and painted netting throughout the entire figure, covering it with this brownish body, which has multiple layers of color in there. There's some lighter tans, there's some darker reddish browns. There's some areas that kind of look like the yellow that NECA captured on their figure, but overall it's much more muddy paint job. The armor still has a similar look to what it did before. If you peel up the skulls here, we can see some kind of ornate detailing there in the center of the chest. The full chest armor going on here. On the right shoulder, we have the upper shoulder piece, which is kind of softer rubber, on the lower shoulder piece, and falling dreadlocks. I mentioned those fell out. And if we go down the arm, we have his gauntlet, we have a fisted hand, we have the long extended main blades, and then this lower kind of chopper-esque blade. Now, this is an interesting inclusion on both of these figures because Chopper didn't exist in the McFarlane AVP line. He's the only major Predator from the film that didn't get a figure, but for some reason they took his iconic big lower blades and transposed them to every other Predator in the line. Celtic came with them. I actually ripped them off the figure. It's one of the first things I did when I got it. And that does leave a bit of an unsightly gap here at the bottom of the gauntlet, but fortunately it is the bottom. So a very odd choice by McFarlane there. We flip our Elder around to the other side. We have his biomask there on his shoulder, just like in the movie. The kind of detailing there on the top, I think that was actually like a leather strap with some kind of jewel on it going across the front. Some biomechanically detailing on the side. His mask looks like it might be just big enough to fit on the Elder's face. The Elder does kind of have a tiny head, and I partly wonder if they gave him that smushed face because at some point they maybe intended you to be able to take this mask off and put it on him. But it doesn't look like you could do that now. It feels like there's a peg behind it that if I remove the mask, I'd have to cut the peg off to be able to get it to even sit on his face. So I think until NECA puts theirs out, I'm not even going to try. And you can see the Elder, while he has the mask, Celtic just has more armor just like he does on the other arm. They both have the extending down piece on the bicep. And I hadn't mentioned the different gauntlets here, but I hadn't realized until looking a little closer they have different hands. Elder has a more traditional gripping hand, the fingers all curled in. Celtic has this very odd pose where only the last digit of his fingers is curled in. I can't even physically do it with my hand, but only the tips of his fingers are curled. The rest of his hand is kind of in this flat pose. I don't know what the point of that was, but it's a very interesting sculpt. The other plus side with the Elder is that you can actually flip open his computer, just like on the NECA versions. The hinge here feels really flimsy. I'd be very, very careful with it. But we do get some nice detailing in there, which is pretty impressive. We're going to swap back over to Celtic to look at the lower body here, because without the cape, it's a little easier to see the belt. Both figures have very similar belts. I guess the basic underlying belt is the same. We have the rubberized little crotch armor here in the front. On the sides, we each have a leg armor piece that hangs down. Once again, soft rubber. And on the back, we do have the butt flap. All the little detailings around the belt are identical. All these little pouches are included, a little buckle in front, but Celtic is given a couple folded up shurikens here on his hip that are unique to him. The Elder does not have it. The legs carry on a lot of the same detail as the rest of the body, the sculpted in netting and the paint job. The shin guards have a very hammered metal look, which is very nice. Same kind of dull silver going on there. We do have the sheath on the leg for the ceremonial blade, and it does fit in there pretty nicely. More of the same detail around the back, and some pretty good detailing on the feet. I feel like there's better skin detail here than there is on the rest of the figure. Some nice kind of warty textures to it and a nice kind of shine there as well. But it is the standard AVP sandals with the claws going up over the toes and the little side claws sticking out. For articulation, we'll use Elder because he still has the most functioning articulation of the two. There is a hinge, a disc hinge in the neck, so he should be able to look up and down. I believe he can also rotate at the head. Unfortunately, Mine's totally busted, so there is no actual joint in there anymore. They just kind of hold on decently. But we'll pull all this extra crap off of him just to make the rest of the articulation go a little smoother. Up here at the shoulders, we actually have a butterfly joint, so the shoulders will kind of hinge in and out, which I think is a very nice touch. The articulation doesn't really lend to him reaching over and using his computer or anything. At the shoulder, we can rotate forward and back as well as swing out to the side. His other shoulder seems a little hindered. I think that's just because of the armor. I think this armor's a little too stiff to really allow his arm to move that way, but it should theoretically have the same articulation. We also do have a bicep swivel in there. We have a cut joint at the elbow, which kind of sucks. It makes it a little hard to get his arms in poses you want him to be in, but it's there. The wrists feel like they're able to swivel, but they don't want to. And then there's also a hinge. You can go up and down with the hands. Very, very tight on this figure, though I don't want to force it. At the mid-torso, you do have an ab crunch, a nice hinge joint there with a pretty good range of motion. Once again, I think there's a joint here at the waist that you can rotate, but mine feels like it might have been glued. There's even some white residue in there, so I'm really thinking that's broken on this figure. The legs aren't bad. They'll go forward and back as well as out to the side on a pin and socket joint. We have a cut joint up here at the upper leg, once again really not wanting to move. We have a single joint there at the knee, and then a rotation and a hinge down here at the foot, another joint that does not want to move, but it looks like you could actually move that ball joint inside and change the angle at which the ankle is moving, which would be cool if I wasn't so afraid to break it. And here's a comparison of the two Celtic Predators side by side, McFarlane on the left, NECA on the right. I don't know if it was really even necessary for me to say that because the differences are night and day. It's really funny seeing NECA's version next to the McFarlane because NECA had made a big point that they'd slimmed down their version of the AVP Predators to not make them quite so football player looking like they did in the movie, but NECA's version is still much bigger and beefier looking than the McFarlane, which I shouldn't be so surprised at because NECA figures have tended to be a bit larger than McFarlane figures across the board. However, if for some reason you do have the old McFarlane ones and you don't want to go get the new NECA ones, there's not a gigantic size difference. There's just a lot of quality difference and a lot of technology difference going into how these figures were made. Overall, it's kind of hard to give these figures a terrible review just because they're old. They're using figure making technology that isn't used much anymore. For good reason. Messing around with these guys kind of reminds me of how I feel messing around with an old Toy Biz Marvel Legends. And before you guys all get your pitchforks out and attack me, let me clarify that a little bit. While I know everybody loves Toy Biz Marvel Legends for their detailing level, paint apps, I've always thought their articulation was very goofy. And I feel like the articulation on these AVP Predators is very in line with those old Toy Biz Legends. The butterfly joints at the armpits, they're kind of weird. The articulation kind of makes the body bulge in certain parts and just have a strange shape to it that doesn't always serve the sculpt. On top of that too, the paint apps are fairly dull, the lower arm blades are just very questionable, and the overall construction of these figures is weak. And as I said at the top, they're some of the most breakable action figures I've ever messed with. And even the parts that haven't broken feel so brittle. And I don't know if that's an age thing and just a bad plastic choice that was made back then. If I had these in 2004 or 2005 when they came out, I don't know if I'd be having those exact same complaints. But I have older figures, and none of them were quite as fragile as this. So I'm really leaning towards the fact that they were just made out of brittle plastic. So if I was doing outside the box reviews back then, I think these guys would get a recommend. But by today's standards, and especially with NECA having put theirs out, I'm gonna give them a very, very slight not recommend. We should be getting an Elder Predator from NECA. I guess if NECA was adamantly saying they would not put one out, I might recommend the Elder just to fill that gap in your collection. But because that's supposed to be on the way, I'm going to go ahead and put them both in the same category. Make sure you follow me on Instagram, username Outside the Box Reviews. Also check me out on Facebook, link below. And until next time, this has been our Outside the Box Reviews. Stay tuned for more to come.